Right.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Feller. Thank you all for coming out on what looks to be a not so pleasant evening this evening. You mentioned Virginia, and I'm frowning because March Madness is not treating Virginia well. But I don't know. I don't even like basketball, and I'm still a little sad. But so my training is as a labor economist, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about what determines people's pay, and that's the basis of what I'm going to talk about today is the gender wage gap. So a little background, which maybe to give you sort of where I'm coming from. I grew up a pretty geeky girl. I went to a science and tech school that was predominantly male. I have two older brothers and a military father, and and I have two sons, and I am in a profession that's predominantly male as well. So about 30% of Ph.D.s in economics go to women, and by the time you get to full professor, which is where I'm at now, it's about 10% women. So I have spent most of my life and my career surrounded by men, and I'm good with that. But just to give you a little perspective as someone who's coming at it from a male-dominated profession. Okay. You've probably all heard this statistic before. This is from the previous administration, from President Obama's website. You can still find it on the cache versions of whitehouse.gov. On average, full-time working women earn just 78 cents for every dollar a man earns. It's not unusual. I don't know if y'all do it here. It's not unusual. Sometime around April or so that you'll get like an equal pay day, or somewhere during the course of the year you'll see this statistic floated around campus. Where you'll see this kind of thing. I tried to find a similar thing on the current administration, but there isn't one. So I'm going to stick with the old ones for now. So they also provided these convenient e-cards that you could share with your friends. You could put on Facebook. It says in 2011, a typical 25-year-old woman working full-time all year earned $5,000 less than a typical 25-year-old man. In just 10 years, her cumulative lost wages will reach $34,000. By age 65, the average woman will have lost, I don't have my glasses on, but I think that says $431,000 over her working lifetime as a result of an earnings gap. So this is probably a statistic that most of you are familiar with, and this is the statistic I want to start with today, is sort of what makes up this gap that we see between men and women. I'm going to warn you, I'm a little bit of a data geek, so I'm going to start with a bunch of data. So, data. These are median earnings. These are some historical data on the gender wage gap. These are median earnings of a full-time year-round worker. They're inflation adjusted, so these are all in 2012 dollars. And you can see in 1960, we were thinking like here, men on average, the median man was earning about $38,000, the median woman was earning about $22,000. And the pattern that we're going to see is the same pattern we're going to see regardless of how we measure it. So we see an increase in male median earnings during the 1960s and 70s, and then male earnings have kind of been flat for the last 40 years. For women, we see a much more steady upward trajectory, and the combination of those two things means that the gap has closed somewhat during the course of these 40 years. So median earnings for women are about 76%. So this is roughly that 78% number. Okay? And this is exactly what that number is referring to, is if we take all the full-time full-year workers who are men and all the full-time full-year workers who are women, and we take the person in the middle of each of those groups, and we're going to compare them. Okay? So a lot of times I talk to my students and ask them what they think is behind that number, what's behind that 78 cents number, and they think what the number is referring to is two people in the same job. So if you compare two men, a man and a woman who hold the same position, same background, same education, that the woman earns 78, 80 cents on the dollar of the man. That's not what that statistic is. That statistic is this. So of all the men ranked from lowest earning to highest earning, take the guy in the middle, and then compare that for all the women, rank them from lowest earning to highest women, take the woman in the middle, and compare those two people. Okay. So You may say, okay, I don't like those numbers. Those are yearly earnings. We can look at something different. So this is data from the Pew Research Center. These are hourly earnings. There's a lot of stuff going on here. The darker lines, the solid lines, the top light green line is for all men who are 16 and older. And you can see the same sort of pattern. The time horizon's a little shorter. So from 1980 to 2012, you see that fairly flat in inflation-adjusted terms. Men's earnings are fairly flat. Okay. In 1980, the median man was earning $18.57 an hour, and in 2012, it's slightly less than that at $17.79. And you see the same trend for women that we saw in the previous graph. So we see that trending upwards for women from roughly $12 an hour in 1980 for the median woman to almost $15 an hour in 2012 for the median woman. The dotted lines here are for a younger group. So those are for men and women 25 to 34, so sort of fairly early in their career, but after finishing schooling. And you can see kind of a starker closing of the gap. Okay, we see the decline for male earnings, the increase for female earnings, so that the gap by 2012 for men and women, median man and median woman in 2012 is pretty small. I currently have what it is, 93% of women in 2012 who are aged 25 to 34 are earning 93% of what men aged 25 to 34 are earning in 2012. Okay, so the gap is smaller for young people than it is for the whole labor force. The gap is closing over time, and it's closing for two reasons. It's closing because male earnings are stagnant and female earnings are increasing. Can't get enough data. Okay, this one's from the Wall Street Journal using data from Department of Labor. It's a little bit, because this one goes back to 1979. These are for people who are paid hourly. So if I'm not paid hourly, right? I'm paid a salary. I get the same no matter how many hours I work. This is just looking at people who are working and paid an hourly wage. But the pattern, again, is pretty similar. We see women's earnings increasing a little bit more slowly, but increasing over the time period. We see the decline for men in the 80s, and then the flatlining. Okay, so again, a closing of the gap due to those two things, men's earnings stagnating, women's earnings slightly increasing. Okay, not only is the gap, so those are a couple different ways to look at the gap getting smaller. This is a graph from an economist, from Claudia Golden's work on the gender wage gap. Here, another way we can think about this gap getting smaller is by this. These are just college-educated workers. Okay? And each of these lines reflects a different birth cohort. So this bottom line are men and women who were born in 1958 and what happens during the course of their career. So the wage gap at age 28 for that birth cohort was that women were earning about 88 cents for every dollar a man was earning. Through the course of their career, that wage gap got bigger and bigger until it flatlined around here, where by age 47, women who were born in 1958 are earning 70 cents on the dollar for a man. Okay? So one thing you can see from this graph is that through people's career, the wage gap gets larger. Okay? So early in their career, the wage gap is smaller. As they get older, the wage gap gets bigger. Okay? As you move up the lines, those are more recent birth cohorts. So these are every 5 years. So the cohort that was born in 1978 hasn't been observed that long, but you can see that they started their careers with a smaller wage gap, and they're continuing to see that increase in the wage gap as they age. This is just for full-time workers who are college educated. So we know a few things. Women earn on average less than men earn. The gap is getting smaller over time. So over the last 40 years, the gap has gotten smaller. And during the course of your career, as you age, the gap gets bigger. Okay. Okay. So there's your data. So we're going to talk a little bit about theory. Okay. So what determines how much people get paid? So there's a whole field. This is what labor economists study, is sort of what determines how much people get paid. And I'm going to classify them in a couple different categories. Well, I'm not, but we do. Labor economists do. Okay. The first is what we call human capital. So human capital is an investment. They are the skills that are embodied in your person. Okay. So one way you can get human capital is by going to school. So you can get more educated. And by doing that, you are investing in yourself. So you're learning new skills that will, at a cost of foregoing earnings or paying tuition or buying books or whatever it might be. You get some schooling at a cost today, and you expect in the future to earn more money because of that. Okay. This is probably what a lot of people, you may not call it human capital, but this is what a lot of people think about when they're thinking about schooling as a way to increase their earnings or their compensation. Okay. You can get human capital in other ways too. You can gain skills by working more. So one way that you earn more skills is by spending more time at work, spending more years working. As you work longer during the course of your career, presumably you get better at your job. Okay? And as you improve your job skills, your pay should reflect that. The other big way that people get human capital is tenure. This is not like my kind of tenure, like the dean can't fire me kind of tenure. This is like, tenure is how long you spend working at your current workplace. Okay? So there's some advantages to staying at the same employer. Some of those might be more obvious. So maybe you work at a bank that has a proprietary software system and you have to learn how to use it, and you get better at using it. And so the longer you stay at the employer, the more valuable those skills are. Okay. It could be somewhat, they could be soft skills too. Right? So one advantage at staying at the same employer is that you know the culture, you know who to go to, you know how to get what you want from the people who are sort of assigned to do that. Or Bob and I are having these conversations about like someone on my campus who basically brought a gift for the accounts payable lady to make sure her bills actually got paid, you know, and that she was able to get everything done. So those sort of figuring out the culture and how to get things done at your workplace are also sort of part of this, learning how to manage up and the like. Okay. Part of the experience, part of human capital here is how many hours you work, which is going to end up playing an important role here too. Okay, so skills are good. Having more skills means you're going to get paid more, but all skills are not the same. Okay, so the other thing that's going to determine a worker's pay is what kind of skills you have. Okay, do you have more quantitative skills? Do you have more soft skills? Do you have are you able to lift heavy objects? All of those things are skills, okay, but they're not all skills that have the same return in the labor force. Okay, so one of the things that's going to determine your pay is also the kind of skills you have. As we dig into it, the way labor economists think about this are things like, what did you study? What kind of occupation do you have? Okay. And the last major item I'm going to put on my list here is how pleasant is your job? How safe is your job? Okay, we have a term for this, they're called compensating wage differentials. But the gist of it is this: if your job is unpleasant, I'm going to have to pay you more to get you to do it. Okay, so the example I would typically give in a labor class is I would ask, we have two jobs in the world. You can be a chocolate taster or you can be a ditch digger. And they both pay $10 an hour. How many of you want to dig ditches? How many of you want to taste chocolate? So everybody wants to taste chocolate, nobody wants to dig ditches. Okay, but if it turns out I really need some ditches dug, I'm going to have to hire someone. What if I paid you $20 an hour to dig ditches and $10 an hour to taste chocolate? Would anybody dig ditches? Okay, I got like half the, okay, that's not bad. Sometimes it takes me a while to get there. so most people would prefer, everything else equal, to taste chocolate. Occasionally I'll get someone who hates chocolate or really likes physical labor, but for the most part, I would have to pay people more to take the less pleasant job. Okay? It's true when you sort of think about it with introspection yourself, but it's also true in the data. When jobs are dangerous, when jobs are loud, when jobs are uncomfortable, like outside, not in air conditioning, those kinds of jobs pay more, everything else equal, because they're less pleasant. Okay? There's a significant part of economists who deal with this issue, who spend a lot of time thinking about what we have to pay people to compensate for risk. Okay, so there's like 8 weeks of labor economics in like 5 minutes for you, so there you go. Anyway. All right, but we know this. So we know pay differs based on education, experience, tenures, types of skill, and job pleasantness. Okay, let's go back to the beginning. So women are paid less than men. We also know that. Okay, but that doesn't control for any kinds of characteristics that might also differ, on average, for men and women. Okay. So one question we need to ask ourselves is how much of this wage gap is explained by gender differences in my other list? Do women have the same set of skills as men do? Do men have the same amount of schooling that women do? Same amount of experience as women do? Are women employed in jobs that have the same kinds of characteristics as men do? Okay. And it turns out the answer to all of those questions is no. Okay. Some of the major factors that account for this gender wage gap are the ones we just talked about. Schooling, work experience, in particular career interruptions for childbearing and raising, but also sometimes for other types of family care, and choice of occupation and industry, which I'm going to take as a proxy for kinds of skills. Okay, so let's start. More data. All right. I'm going to guess, I forgot to look it up on my way here, but if IUE is like every other university, it's probably majority female. Yes? So it's true that men and women differ in their schooling. In this case, it doesn't help us explain the gender wage gap. Women are better educated than men are in the U.S. Okay? This is one graph from this is from this IWPR, which is a left-leaning think tank. This is for people who are working, so women workers compared to male workers. So the women are the red ones, the men are the blue ones. Okay, so male workers are more likely to be high school dropouts. 9% of male workers are high school dropouts, 6% of female workers are. Slightly more likely also to be high school graduates with no more schooling than that. Once we get to some college, men and women are roughly the same. Women are more likely to have an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, or a postgraduate degree. Okay. So women tend to be better educated than our men. I have another graph, but this has actually been true. If we went back and looked at the data for a long time, this has been true for a long time. Women have been the majority of bachelor degree recipients since about the early 80s. Okay, so this is not like a new phenomenon. Fairly recently, I think 50% of doctoral degrees were, women just crossed the 50% mark for doctoral degrees. Okay, so educational attainment is higher for women than men. That's lovely, but it doesn't really help to explain the story here, right? If women are better educated than men, then women should on average be paid more than men. Okay, that's not the case. On the other hand, experience is higher for men than women, even once we control for schooling. Okay. Experience is higher for two reasons. Among full-time workers, so whether we define that as typically we're thinking about people who are working 35 hours or more a week. Among full-time workers, men work more hours than women do. And women are more likely to take time out of the labor force to not be working, okay, primarily for childbearing and rearing. I don't think that's surprising to people, but I'll give you a little bit of data. Maybe the first part is a little bit surprising. This is a graphic from the same report as the previous one from the IWPR, but it's using BLS data. These are average hours per day for people who are working. Okay, I'm going to focus on the full-time workers because that's the data we're thinking about here. So this is average hour time worked in a workday, okay, for men and for women. So the blue ones here are an average day, and the green ones here are a weekday. I blanked out the weekends just because I was trying to make the graph look a little bit less. It's already busy. Okay. So here's men, and an average, let's look at full-time workers because that's who we're focusing on. The average man on a weekday works, it's hard to read on that graph, male workers work 8.4 hours for an average day, full-time workers, and women full-time workers work 7.3 hours. So 7.3 hours for women, 8.4 hours for men. Okay. Sounds small, but that means that women are working 80% of the hours that men are working on average. Okay. This matters. Okay. It matters both for salary pay and hourly pay, regardless of how you're being paid. Okay. It matters if you're getting paid hourly because you're working fewer hours, so you're going to get paid less during the course of the year. Okay. It matters even if you're being paid on a salary, and I'll come back to this at the very end, if there's a benefit to having the same person at work for a longer period of time. So we might think there's some jobs where having two people, each of them working 4 hours in a day, is the same as having one person work 8 hours a day. So there's some jobs that look like this, okay? But there's some jobs that don't look like that. There's some jobs where you really want the same person working 8 hours instead of two different people. Okay. To the extent that if there's a return to having the same person being there at work, then when women work fewer hours, we would expect them to be paid less because it's less valuable to the consumer or to the employer. There's some really nice papers who dig into this, the dropping out of the labor force to have kids and how that affects your pay in great detail. It would take me a significant amount of time to go through the complicated stuff that they do. There's this lovely paper from people at the Atlanta Fed who can track the in and outness of male and female workers throughout their whole career. So they can see, did you take 6 weeks of maternity leave? Did you take a month off to help your elderly mother or whatever throughout the course of the year? And what they estimate is that the fact that women are more likely to do those things, that intermittency, that coming in and out of the workforce, explains about 1/3 of the gender wage gap. I'm going to suggest it more than anything with a little bit of data here. Okay. This is the median gender pay gap for full-time workers, again, by age, so workers who are 18. Okay. In 1975, so this is 18-year-old workers in 1975, men were paid, male 18-year-old workers in 1975 earned 10% more than female workers in 1975. Okay. As we looked at older people working during 1975, the gap gets as big as 30%. So by mid-career, the 40-year-olds here, 40-year-old men are earning 30% more than 40-year-old women in 1975. Okay. If we look in 2006 across the distribution of ages in the labor force, that picture looks really different. Okay. So we see briefly men earning about 5% more than women. In their 20s, we see 24 to 30-year-old men and women are earning roughly the same. In some cases, women are earning more. And then once we hit about 33, we see the gap starting to increase. I'm going to suggest that a lot of this is also things like intermittency. Okay? These are people staying home. Average age of marriage is 28, 26, somewhere around here. Okay? Start to have children. They start to spend somewhat more time out of the labor force, and then their wages reflect that. Okay. Men and women don't have the same skills. Okay? In particular, men study more quantitative fields than women. Yeah, Bob's laughing because these are my kids. So these are my kids on their first day of school this year. My daughter was not going to school. And I put it up here to remind me to tell you a story. So this is my crazy daughter and her two big brothers. And my mom, who was a middle school math teacher her whole career, was helping Catherine build a train track. And I was like, oh, wow, you're really good at this, Mom. Can you do another one? She wants this really fancy thing. And she looked at me, she goes, you know, if I could do it over, like I would have been a civil engineer when, you know, for my career. And I kind of looked at her and I was like, she's a really bright woman. She was an excellent middle school math teacher, but you know what, she didn't do it. And she didn't do it because women in her generation, for the most part, didn't do it. Right? If you came out of college, she graduated from Western, where I work now, around 1970. And most women, the vast majority of women, were either housekeepers, nurses, or school teachers. She chose to be a school teacher. And she did very well at it, okay? But she never felt she had that range of choices available to her as a young woman. Okay? I'm going to offer a guess that my daughter does feel like she has those choices to be a civil engineer if she chooses. But it's still the case that lots of fields are predominantly male and predominantly female. I'm going to show you a couple graphs from this guy. He's a statistician. His name is Randy Olson. He has some really beautiful graphics online. Most of them are very complicated. This is for undergraduate degrees. So these are undergraduate degrees that are awarded in the year along the bottom axis. Okay, and the percent of them that are conferred to women. Okay, so engineering's sort of easy to see because it's on the bottom here in 1970. Here's the 0%. Here's the no women majoring in civil engineering, right, when my mom's finishing college. We see a slight increase in the 1970s and 80s. It's kind of tapered off. Engineering is a little less than 20% female now. Okay. You can see the ones that are still, we see women are going to college in greater proportions than men are during this period too, so percent women's going to go up anyways. But you can see sort of as we go, what are the ones that are still predominantly female? Engineering, computer science, the physical sciences, so this would be like chemistry and physics, architecture, math, and stats. Business, social sciences end up right in the middle. Okay. At the top, you can see the predominantly female disciplines, so the health professions, okay, those are nurses, but lots of other people as well. But in 1970, you can see that was already 70, 80% female, and it's now up in the high 85s. Okay. Public administration, schooling, teaching has been a female-dominated major for a long time. Psychology was roughly even in 1970. It's heavily female now. In some schools, in most schools, it's 80, 90%. And the like, biology is here. The one that's weird, you'll hear this if you follow some of the news on this, computer science has got the funkiest one. Right? They had this huge run-up in women in the 70s and 80s just as it was getting hot. And then they're the one that's really experienced this decline in women over time. A lot going on there, which is interesting. Okay. So obviously men and women are choosing to major in different stuff. Okay. And it matters what you major in. Okay. It's from the same guy. So what we have on the bottom here are the percent of people in that major today who are female, and then their median yearly earnings. Okay. So here's our elementary ed majors. Heavily female, low annual earnings. Psychology, biology, also one of the most heavily female sciences. Nursing is a pleasant exception, right? Heavily female, but a good paying profession. The thing to do, oil and gas engineering. You can make like 6 figures coming out of college. So if you had to do it again, oil and gas engineering. But the mining, mineral engineering, they're up here, right? Predominantly female engineering, mechanical, and the like. Okay, there's a return to quantitative skills in the labor force. The people who are majoring in those quantitative fields are more likely to be men. It's also the case that job characteristics differ by gender. So women are better educated, men have more experience, and men have skills that are rewarded more highly in the labor market. It's also the case that men take less pleasant jobs. I like this graph. Mark Perry kind of beats this horse a little more than I would prefer, but I think this makes the point. Okay, how likely are you to die at work? Okay, the vast majority, 92% of workplace fatalities happen to men. Okay, that's probably not surprising if you think of the kinds of jobs you are likely to die in: construction, our first responders, law enforcement, being in the military. These are all heavily male occupations, and so most people who die due to occupational injuries are men. We had our HR thing when I started my job at Western. They're talking about all this like workers' comp, and I'm thinking, what's going to happen to me as a professor? I'm going to trip over the step and break my leg? And apparently, yes. Apparently bulbs break on the transparency things, and all kinds of crazy things can happen. But I'm going to guess that I'm highly unlikely to die in my job. So not only are men more likely to die, and they need to be compensated for that risk of death when they take those jobs, but men are more likely to have jobs that are noisy, that are outside, and that are dangerous. Okay, so if we take all that stuff, human capital, work experience, labor market intermittency, your occupation and your industry, and we control for all of that, what we end up with, this is a report from the Department of Labor, okay, is these factors account for something like 2/3 to 3/4 of the gender wage gap. Okay? Leaving us with an adjusted gender wage gap, a gap that's not explained by these factors, of somewhere between 5 and 7 cents on the hour. Okay? So I'm going to suggest that, in fact, this statistic we should be touting is not that women earn 78 cents for every dollar a man earns, but that women earn like 95 cents, 96 cents, 97 cents for every dollar. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. 95, 94, 93 cents for every dollar a man earns. Great. So what a lot of the literature in economics focuses on now is, okay, but that's still 5 to 7 cents. Why? Where's that 5 to 7 cents coming from if once we're really comparing apples to apples? We can compare a man and a woman in the same job with the same schooling and the same experience. Why aren't we seeing them making the same amount of money? So this is kind of where most of the profession has ended up staying, because that's where the open question is. And to give you a sense of where that literature is going, this is a graphic from The Economist about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, where they're doing the same kind of thing. This red dot here is like the 78 cent step number. Okay, and you'll see it's at like 70, it's like 78 cents. Okay, women are earning 25% less than men are overall. And then they're controlling for experience, education, company size, and job title. So trying to compare apples to apples. And overall, that number gets to, in their calculations, like 3 cents. So this is a very similar exercise to what I just walked you through. Okay. But then they're going to do it for different categories of people. So the ones on the top are single people without children. So the raw gap is smaller. Okay? And then the controlled gap is, it's not quite zero, but it's basically zero. Okay? Single with children, gap is bigger, controlled gap, again, it's small. Okay? Once we control for all those factors, they're getting gaps that are around 3 to 5 cents. Okay? You'll notice a couple things. The raw gaps are bigger when there's children. Okay? The raw gaps are bigger when people are married. Okay? And the raw gaps are different in different professions. So if we look at, this one is arts, entertainment, and recreation. It's smaller than average. If we look in finance, insurance, and medicine, the gap is bigger. Okay, so there seems to be some differences across fields that look important, and there's certainly differences in family circumstances. Okay. So which occupations have the biggest wage gap? It turns out the ones that have big wage gaps are the ones where earnings are not linear in hours worked. So if your earnings were linear in hours worked, then someone who works 40 hours a week makes twice as much as someone who works 20 hours a week. And some professions look like this. If you're a pharmacist, which is it's a well-educated profession, these are well-educated people, but for a pharmacist, if you work 40 hours a week, you are likely making twice as much as someone who works 20 hours a week. It's a highly linear in pay. Some jobs don't look like that at all. Okay, Claudia Golden, I'm going to show you some of her work, but there's also a nice paper in sociology that looks at the same thing, and the terms is overwork. Okay, so overwork they define as people working more than 50 hours a week. This is from Claudia Golden's work. This is for lawyers. So lawyers are one of the, if you're a lawyer, this is one of those professions where it's not linear in hours worked. Okay? So the lawyer who works 25 hours a week earns about $100,000. Okay? The lawyer who works 60 hours a week earns like $350,000 a year. Okay? The red line is going to do that hourly calculation for you. So by hour, what does that work out to? So the person working 25 hours a week, that works out to about $250 an hour. These seem like big numbers, don't they? And the lawyer working 60 hours a week is earning like $350 an hour. Okay, so why does the lawyer who works more hours get paid more money? The basic story is this. If you're engaged in a lawsuit and something comes up on a Friday and you want to talk to your lawyer and you call their office, do you care which lawyer picks up? Do you want it to be your lawyer who's familiar with your case, or do you care if it's any lawyer that works in that practice? It turns out that people actually care. They want the lawyer who's most familiar with their case to pick up the phone and be able to address the issue. That's where this kind of return is coming from. In contrast, if you go to get your prescription filled at the pharmacy, do you care which pharmacist fills your prescription? Probably not. Right? You just need a pharmacist there to fill your prescription. It doesn't matter who it is. Okay. So the professions that have bigger lingering pay gaps tend to look more like lawyers than they look like pharmacists. Okay. It turns out that men are much more likely, this is coming from the paper by these sociologists, their names are Young-Chu Jia and Kim Whedon. And what they find is men are much more likely to work long hours. So 17% of men work 50 hours a week or more. This was in 2007. So 17% of men overwork, and 7% of women overwork. And their estimates is that this increase in overwork that has happened over the past 30 years explains about 10% of the gender wage gap. So we're getting at this from a variety of social scientists that in some professions working long hours is really valuable, and that this is an important part of the gender wage gap. Okay, So, this is one of the other e-cards that no longer exist. It was much better for me when it existed, but okay. And it says this: the wage gap is not a myth, and I agree, it's not a myth. It exists. Okay? But I think we're doing a disservice to everybody by overstating it instead of focusing on what the remaining problem is. The problem is that when we do compare apples to apples, there's this lingering 5 to 7 cent gap. And we need to figure out what's causing it and see if there are remedies to fixing that. Okay? But staying and focusing on this 59 cents in 1963 or 78 cents today, I think is doing us a disservice in trying to correctly address the wage gap. Okay? We should be asking ourselves where these gaps are more likely to exist and why, and is there something that we can or should do about it. Okay? Some of this, and I think one critique of even what I'm showing you here is that, yeah, men and women study different things and they make different choices, but there are different reasons why that might happen, right? It might happen because on average preferences are different between men and women. Okay? It might happen because there's social pressure to behave in a particular way if you're a man or a woman. Okay? To the extent that this is social pressure or that this is discrimination, then I think there's something that we as individuals or we as a society could choose to do about that. Okay, I have, as Feller said, I have an economist-husband as a dual income household who's chosen to have 3 kids. Like we have an interesting logistical life, but we also know a lot of households that look like ours, right? Or that look like ours where the man has chosen to be the primary caregiver. That's actually not that uncommon in academia, that we have 2 professionals and the woman is in the private sector earning a significantly greater amount of money. And I can't tell you how many of these men get made fun of or feel the need to present themselves in a laughing way, like, oh yeah, you know, I'm a kept man, like all I do is, you know, play poker with my buddies and schlep the kids to school. Like, no, they're doing good work that, like, yes, traditionally women have done for years, but, like, it's work that needs to be done. And I think we do everyone a disservice by being intolerant to those choices. So even outside of any public policy implications, I think there's a lot we can do to be more tolerant, to tolerate the man who chooses to be in a more traditionally female profession, to tolerate the woman who chooses to be a civil engineer, or a firefighter, or whatever it might be. And that doesn't require anybody to do anything different other than yourself, right? And to change your attitudes and how you talk to other people about their choices. Did you know, I went to look up how many men are stay-at-home dads. It used to be 0, right? If you went to survey data, in 1950 it was basically 0. 16% of stay-at-home parents are men today, okay? That's still a small number, but it's a huge increase, okay? But I think we need to ask these questions, right? Are women failing to major in math or in computer science or in engineering because they don't like it, which is fine, they don't have to like it, okay? Or are they choosing not to do it because someone's telling them not to, whether that's through discrimination or through social pressure? Are men failing to major in nursing or education because they don't like it, which is fine, they don't have to like it? Or men failing to major in nursing and education because someone's telling them it's not the thing to do, either through discrimination or through social pressure, okay? I think we need to know more about both of those sides of the question and think about how to reduce some of the pushing, both from within the disciplines and industries and socially, you know, when you meet that female physicist or that male nurse. Okay? Because I think all of us, when we live in a society, our society is improved when we allow everyone to flourish by doing the thing that they want to do. Whether you think that they're weird or crazy or funny, human flourishing is improved when we can all make choices that best satisfy our own preferences. So I think if we treat the research fairly, instead of amplifying the problem unrealistically, we can better direct our efforts towards those changes that will actually affect the gap. So thank you. I think I left about 10 minutes for questions. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. Y'all can just look at each other and hope that someone else has questions. I see you back there. Yes?
Most of the examples that you used were kind of like more of a classic economic sort of job settings and so on. I've heard actually it's a podcast, but there's a new article that compares data on this subject from Uber,
Yes.
like gig economy,
Yes.
and also sort of Uber sets a scene that it's totally equal playing field. You can work however many hours you want.
Mm-hmm.
It's your personal decision, regardless whether one is a male or a female, and so on. And so, what's your point of view on that?
So it's a fun story. So maybe to fill in a couple details, it turns out there's a gender wage gap for Uber drivers as well, that women earn less driving for Uber than men do. Although I think a significant part of that gap is explained by the fact that women won't drive in some neighborhoods, and women drive more slowly than men do. On average, right? I mean, there are exceptions to all of these things, but on average. So one of the nice things about the Uber paper is that, in fact, they can observe all of those things. And the problem with a lot of the literature in labor is it's really hard to observe someone's productivity. Okay, there are some exceptions. Sports is one place where we get a lot of it, but it's hard to do gender differences in sports. So the cool thing about the Uber paper is they can observe performance as well. So because they know how long it took them to get from A to B, and they know where people picked up in a given city. So even in that case, a large part of that gap was explained by differences in performances.
But also experience was quite important, as
Yes.
you have added here.
Yes, and I think women came later to Uber
Yeah.
and don't work as many hours.
Exactly.
So-
But the time they spend driving, so the more
Right.
they do so, they select sort of time frames when there is a surcharge and so on, so they actually make more money, and that comes with experience as well.
That makes sense. And it would not surprise me, I don't remember seeing this in the paper or not, but it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of women are doing it, they want to pick up some money while their kids are in school or something like that. Well, that's great. It's a good way to pick up some money, but you're not getting the late nights or the ball game let out, and there's a huge rush of people who need a place, somewhere to go, and the bar's closed, right? Like those are very different kinds of driving circumstances even for them. So, yes.
Is this data pretty much just in the United States, or is this worldwide? How extensive does it go?
So this is all U.S. data. So, and I think a little bit to our shame, the labor economics discipline in general in the U.S. it is highly U.S.-centric, I would say. It's also very difficult to do some of these comparisons across countries. There are other studies in other countries. I think the general pattern in the data in most Western countries tends to be similar. The gap exists. It's gotten smaller over time, but it's still there. And that probably family life has a lot to do with it.
Yes, and I hear the family life, but then I'm looking at women as they get in their 50s, when children, for the most part, should become much more independent, but the gap, but it gets flat, it flattens, and it just stays there, too. It doesn't, so if family should be out of the picture, or relatively out of the picture by then, and it gets flat, and it's just once it reaches a point, it's like there's really no change in that trend.
Right, that's a really interesting point, and you're right about the data. Like the gap is pretty flat. It's gotten as big as it's going to get by your mid to late career.
And it doesn't go down either.
And it doesn't, right, it doesn't go down. So, I mean, there's a couple of possible things that are going on. One is certainly your parents, although your kids may be out of the house, your parents are sort of possibly reaching the ages where they need care, and women are also doing the bulk of that care. So even without children, there's some elder care that might be part of the story. There's also a whole other part of this that I didn't get into because it's a little bit complicated, which is I mean, who's choosing to work is also changing over time, right? And the other part of the story here is that male labor force participation is declining, so fewer and fewer men are working full-time. Women's has increased over that 40-year period, but it's been, relatively flat-ish, probably still increasing lightly. But who is working among the women has changed, okay? And it continues to change. So if you were a less educated woman, you were working, and you have been working for 100 and some odd years. For what we have data, you were working, probably for paid employment. If you were higher income, maybe you stayed home to take care of your kids and you lived off one income. And so the selection of women into the labor force has gone from being less educated women to more educated women. And so there's also this weird, and I don't know how that's going to play into the story, right? Like if you've earned enough at 50, do you retire? Did your husband retire? Are you married? Right? If you got divorced, are you then back in the labor force? So I think there's also, I don't know. And so I don't have a good answer. I think it's a really good question. And it probably ties into where I thought the guy in the back was going with his question, which is what happens with self-employed people? Right? You're setting your own hours, you're setting your own pay. If I'm remembering the literature correctly, I think women still earn less than men, even if they're self-employed. Okay, but that might be another way that women are kind of coming back. Yes?
Is there data showing where women are increasing their role in leadership positions in the company? Is there data showing that that wage gap in that company is decreasing?
So like if women are at upper levels of leadership, is the wage gap smaller?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that exactly. My guess is no. Just because what I do know suggests that women don't seem to be particularly less likely to discriminate than men are.
Gotcha.
But I think if nobody knows the answer to that question, someone should totally write that paper.
Well, I just see, you hear on the news and you read that women are getting in more leadership positions.
Yep.
And what you're seeing too is the generational gap between the baby boomers, Gen X, and millennials, is that though the generation between the women in those different types of sectors is kind of what I'm trying to say is that the millennials in those higher positions, they're the ones pushing for that decrease.
So I have two responses, I guess. One is that I think what we know about the millennials' attitude towards their work is likely to be particularly good for women relative to men, to the extent that they want more flexible work hours and work arrangements. That's particularly good for women who want to have that flexibility, more so than men want to have that flexibility. That would be my first thing. The other response I would have is, it makes me think of two things. That the book, the Lean In book, which is basically like, oh no, you need to work more hours, which, yeah, that's okay, but lots of women don't want to, right? And I'm terrible with names. The Yahoo lady.
Oh,
Marissa.
Did she get fired though? Or did she get
Or the former Yahoo lady.
former.
Who took her 3 days of maternity leave or whatever. And then said, oh yeah, we'll have these flexible work arrangements. No, I don't want them. You guys need to be in the office. And so that makes me, it's anecdotal, it's not data, but I mean, again, it's suggestive that here are two really prominent women in leadership who are basically saying, no, you need to be overworking. You need to be working more than 50 hours and they need to be in the office, right? Which is particularly challenging for closing that gender wage gap. Great. Well, thank you all for coming.